So I'm Shawna Dolansky, and I'm the co-chair of the conference, and Deidre just stole my thunder by saying that for me. And I wanted to welcome everybody this morning as well, and I especially want to welcome our speaker for this morning, Deborah Kaufman. Debbie and I met a number of years ago in Boston when we were teaching together at Northeastern University, and I was very, very happy that we were able to invite her here this morning and to the conference to be part of it. I learned a lot from teaching with Debbie, and it was like a post-grad school kind of education by fire because we were teaching graduate students, and Debbie convinced me that I too could teach feminist methodology, even though I'd never taken a course in the subject, and we did it together twice, which means that it was successful, and we still liked each other. So it is my very, very great pleasure to welcome Debbie this morning, and I'll give you her official bio now, which is long and impressive. Deborah Renee Kaufman is a professor emerita and Matthews Distinguished University Professor at Northeastern University. She was the founding director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program and one of the founding directors of the Jewish Studies program. Her award-nominated feminist books include Rachel's Daughters, which was nominated for 3 awards, and Achievement and Women, co-authored with Barbara Richardson, which received honorable mention at C. Wright Mills. Her edited volumes, which relate to her current work on gender, Jewish identity, and post-Holocaust narratives include From the Protocols of Zion to the Holocaust Denial Trials, Challenging the Media, the Law, and the Academy, a special edition of Contemporary Jewry entitled Women's Scholarship and the Holocaust, and her forthcoming book, Post-Holocaust Contemporary Narratives, What Do We Talk About When We Talk About the Holocaust? She has been a visiting scholar at the Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies at Oxford in England, the Murray Research Center at Radcliffe College, the Wellesley Center for Women, and has guest lectured around the world, including Frey University in Germany, where she conducted a seminar on post-Holocaust narratives among young adults in the United States and Israel. Her research this morning, her paper this morning will draw on her research on Jewish identity and post-Holocaust narratives. So everybody please welcome Debbie Kaufman.
Good morning. I am so honored to be here. I'm glad that I did not remain a single act, as I was asked as a distinguished lecturer for the Association for Jewish Studies, and Deirdre and Shawna had chosen my name to come, and I was supposed to come in March, but then this conference came into being, and they said, we have to have you be a part of the conference. So, and I'm so pleased that she did so. I'm learning so much. Yesterday was just mind-blowing in many ways. Such dynamic speakers and just a mix of politics and scholarship and a lot of energy. And it feels so good to be here. So thank you. And I'm also learning how to say about. I'm learning how to say project, and I will go home and bring my Canadian linguistics back with me. So what do we talk about when we talk about the Holocaust? Post-memory narratives and Jewish identity. The title of, I'm going to apologize from the beginning. I am going to read. I feel that as I age, I tend to ramble. And so if I'm going to make it within the time slot that has been allotted me, I'm going to read. The title of my talk is a slightly reworked title I borrowed from the most recent book, What Do We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank, by award-winning author Nathan Englander. In that story, Englander's protagonists, not children or grandchildren of the Holocaust, of Holocaust survivors, but 4th and 5th generation young Jewish adults, talk of a game they used to play when they were children. Who of their Gentile neighbors would hide them should the Holocaust happen again? The story highlights what Englander sees as one of the post-memory legacies of the Holocaust. Even for those of us not directly related to Holocaust survivors, we carry the collective fear that it could happen again in and among the most advanced and civilized nations in the world. That as a group, we carry with us a post-traumatic fear of an event we never experienced personally. Moreover, writes sociologist Jeffrey Alexander and cultural critic John Stratton, this post-traumatic fear extends beyond the Jewish communities of the West to the West itself. Jeffrey Alexander contends that the post-Holocaust era represents a post-traumatic society, and that we who have come generations later and have grown up in the West are all in some sense of the word Holocaust survivors. For Alexander, the Holocaust has moved from what he calls a progressive discourse of Allied victory for the forces of democracy after World War II to a tragic discourse about trauma and genocide by the end of the 20th century. Some cultural analysts argue that no event is in and of itself a collective trauma until it becomes part of the collective memory of a nation, state, or group. And I think I'm going to divert, I shouldn't do this, just a little bit to tie it back to yesterday. This notion of remember and not forgetting is part of this theoretical understanding that it cannot be represented until it becomes part of a collective memory. Perhaps even more controversial is the claim that it is not the experience itself that produces the trauma, but rather the remembrance of that experience. Some scholars contend that no matter how horrific, there is nothing intuitive or common sense about any social upheaval as a collective trauma until there is what we call a narrative discourse, a story that moves it beyond a specific time and place, until there is an identification with the victims, and until there is an acceptance of it as a tragedy for all humankind. What we have come to learn is that it takes generations to face fully a cataclysmic social upheaval as traumatic as the Holocaust. It has taken many decades for the Holocaust to become the traumatic event of the 20th century, or the touchstone for evil that it is today. And perhaps, unlike other social upheavals and events, the Holocaust as a tragic and traumatic event in world history continues to shape the memory of the nation, state, for much of Europe, the U.S., and Israel well into the 21st century. Underscoring that there is nothing obvious or inevitable about what we call a cultural trauma, sociologist Jeffrey Alexander outlines the processes in which the narrative discourse we call the Holocaust has emerged. Although the discoveries from April 3rd, 1945 onward, beginning with the liberation of the concentration camps, made abundantly clear that there had been systematic efforts at Jewish mass murder, the media's collective representations of this horror did not itself constitute a traumatic experience for the Western world. For example, in the U.S., Americans were unable, at least initially, to identify with the Jewish victims of World War II. Mass murder itself was not sufficient, since there had been other mass murders linked to other such horrors of earlier wars, particularly World War I. Moreover, since Jews, even after liberation, were kept in horrid conditions for weekends and months, compared, for instance, to non-Jewish survivors, it was particularly difficult to identify with them since they appeared less normal, less human than other survivors. When American citizens and their leaders expressed opinions and made decisions about national quotas for emergency post-war immigration, displaced German citizens ranked first, Jewish survivors last. The gap between an event and the representation of it demands what we call a master cultural narrative. Such a story is simultaneously complex, highly contingent, sometimes contested, and often highly polarizing. Even after the physical discovery of the Nazi concentration camps, the nature of what was seen and discovered had to be what many cultural critics call coded weighted and narrated. For instance, even during the war, when it was clear through leaked intelligence that hundreds of thousands and later millions of Jews were being systematically slaughtered, gassed, and burned by the ovenful, only an occasional news article, for instance, in the New York Times or my hometown, the Boston Globe, even mentioned the murder of Jews, or if mentioned, relegated the story to a brief 3 or 4 paragraph story on page 15. Even when the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Times correspondent C.L. Sulzberger reported from Moscow that 4 million people had been killed at the Nazi death camp called Auschwitz. Though he himself was Jewish and a member of the Sulzberger family, which owned the Times, he did not mention the rather inescapable fact that most of the victims were Jewish. Tracing the news coverage of the Holocaust after the 50-year commemoration, writer and journalist James Carroll notes from about the 1990s onward, after decades of soft-pedaling the story, and for many years simply ignoring it, the press began devoting much front-page attention to the Holocaust. Specifically looking at the 2 years which followed the commemoration of its 50th anniversary in 1995, Carroll notes that in that 2-year period, from 1995 to 1997, there were more than 600 stories appeared in the major newspapers, amounting to about 1 a day. And while other 50th anniversary stories, such as the end of World War II and the first use of atomic weapons in war, were also treated as major stories in 1995, 2 years later, they, unlike Holocaust coverage, could no longer lay claim to any front page of any newspaper. They were already comfortably ensconced as history. But not so with the Holocaust, which not only remained a major story, but seemed almost to grow in scope. Part of the reason for this continuing and growing interest in the Holocaust, argues Carroll, is that as we were drawing closer to the end of the millennium, we were attempting to define its principal characteristics. For Carroll, among them, none stands more visibly on center stage than the Holocaust. The Nazi death camps, writes Carroll, have become the preeminent symbol of the world gone mad, a distillation of the evil that swamped the century. Alexander corroborates Carroll's observation of the initial lack of discourse about the Holocaust when he writes that between the end of the war and the 1960s, the Holocaust made scarcely any appearance in an American public discourse, and hardly more in Jewish public discourse, especially that which was directed to Gentiles. There was, as other Holocaust scholars have noted, almost a full decade of silence. Survivors were discouraged from telling their stories, and there were few books on the subject, scholarly or popular. The Diary of Anne Frank, perhaps, is the most notable exception. Elie Wiesel could not get Night published until 1963, 61, one of the two. Treatment of the Holocaust in high school and history college textbooks was skimpy at best. Indeed, mention of the Holocaust in other than Jewish newspapers and magazines was absolutely rare. While within months of the initial revelations about the Nazi atrocities, the term genocide became the new word to frame public awareness of the attempted murder of an entire people. Jeffrey Alexander claims that the cultural narrative of that period was not yet perceived as a trauma for the post-war period. Rather, it was seen as the triumphant expulsion of evil. The Nuremberg trials, crimes against humanity. In that sense, it is a progressive, not a traumatic narrative. In this early narrative, for non-Jewish groups, the mass killing of Jews, Judeocide, was still not the principal part of the Holocaust story or the Holocaust narrative, nor had the term Holocaust even yet come into being for either Jews or non-Jews. It comes into popular usage and in reference to the murder of European Jews sometime between 1957 and 1959. Usage of Holocaust as was at the Second World Congress of Jewish Studies, which was held in Jerusalem in 1957. After 1959, Yad Vashem gave Holocaust its official imprimatur, switching from translating Shoah as disaster to Holocaust. Tim Cole posits that it is the Eichmann trial in 1961 which captures world attention and breaks the silence about the Holocaust. Some argue that it is the Eichmann trial that moves the Holocaust from its historical particularities to a universally traumatic event, and that is the discourse, the master narrative that I'm talking about. The trial received extraordinary press coverage, particularly, by the way, in the United States. That summer, Gallup conducted a series of in-depth interviews with 500 randomly selected residents of Oakland, California, and found that 84% of those sampled met the minimum criterion of awareness of this faraway event, a striking statistic given Americans' usual indifference to foreign affairs, particularly if you lived in Oakland, California. Hannah Arendt's controversial insistence that the trial made us aware of the banality of evil and that Eichmann could be every man marks a notion of ordinariness that helps create a universal identification with the murder of Jews. The banality of evil and the ordinariness of its perpetrators promote the universalizing of the Holocaust and the beginning of a post-traumatic cultural collective memory, not just for Jews, but for the West itself. The famous obedience study, begun in 1961 following the Eichmann trial, was offered as evidence that ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terribly destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear, and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. You may know that I am referring to the famous Stanley Milgram study. Milgram's work showed that one could follow orders, even those which inflicted pain on others, and actually with a knob turning to near death, despite one's personal conscience. By the late 60s, we see a shift in Holocaust discourse from that of victim to that of survivor, and we heard much yesterday from survivors. A shift, as it were, from the popular archetype of Anne Frank as Holocaust victim, assimilated, universalist in orientation, sheltered by Gentiles, a dependent, a feminine model, to Elie Wiesel, of Hasidic background, Zionist and particularistic in orientation, abandoned by Gentiles, and a masculine discourse of autonomy and surviving. Survivors take center stage in the emerging Holocaust narrative. Survival in the expanding cultural narrative of this period deserves special attention and mention because now what has been survived is characterized as the Holocaust, unique and unrepresentable. This catastrophe is unlike any others. It is beyond a pogrom or any other horrific experience in Jews' history. It is the attempted total annihilation of a people. Moreover, it is genocide against Europeans on European soil. Peter Novick contends that it is the symbol of the survivor as emblematic of Jewish suffering, Jewish memory, and Jewish endurance that made the greatest contribution to Holocaust commemoration and to what I am calling a post-traumatic discourse. In a post-traumatic narrative, the survivor's story and testimony become privileged. Stratton believes that it is not until Israel's victory in the Six-Day War of 1967 that the term Holocaust, with its capital H, signifying its exceptional status, came into common usage in the U.S. and the English-speaking world more generally. Other popular cultural critics claim that it is with the production of the NBC miniseries Holocaust, the story of the family Weiss, which went over a long period of time, 8 weeks, I believe, juxtaposing the German and Jewish story opposite one another. In 1978, that the Holocaust becomes a part of Western memory, or as Stratton claims, a part of a general and non-Jewish cultural memory. The miniseries helps to establish the Holocaust as having a universal, no longer specifically Jewish theme, a morality story about good and evil. Almost a full decade later, this cultural milestone is reinforced with the production of Steven Spielberg's internationally acclaimed and award-winning film, Schindler's List, making, as Stratton claims, the Holocaust a moral touchstone for the postmodern West. The Holocaust discourse, as it emerges in the late 20th century, includes the acknowledgement that there is evil in all of us and in all societies, which no amount of progress, notice, can explain. The mass killings, particularly the Judeocide, become part of a universal history, or in Hegel's terms, an event whose emergence onto the world stage threatens or promises to change the fundamental course of the world. The mass murder within the boundaries of Europe, of other Europeans, of those who had, as Jews, for instance in Germany, become highly visible and integrated into the whole fabric of the society, show that even in a presumably rational, civil, and enlightened world, genocide, even against one's own, could and did occur. To this day, claims Alexander, the Holocaust is almost never referred to without referring to its inexplicability. The Holocaust discourse, Alexander writes, has enlarged the human imagination so that it is capable, for the first time in human history, of identifying, understanding, and judging the kinds of genocidal mass killings in which national, ethnic, and ideological groupings continue to engage in today. It has become a Western post-traumatic narrative for evil, both past and present. I need some water. Okay, I'll keep talking, but I do need some water. This newly weighted narrative is different from the first post-World War II years, wherein the events of the war were seen in discrete terms: concentration camps, ghettos, specific defeats and victories. A new narrative of trauma, tragedy, inexplicability, and suffering takes precedence over the first and progressive narrative of Allied victory and democracy. The new narrative is more wary of progress and or optimism about, quote, the family of man. The Holocaust becomes a primal event, a trauma drama to which we, the audience, returns time and time again. As such, it challenges the ethical self-identification, the self-esteem of modernity, and ultimately the idea of modern progress. And most importantly, it knows that this can happen again, and hence the motto, never again. And I wanted to be sure that we tie that again back to yesterday's references over and over again to never again. Within Jewish communities, contested narratives emerge about how the Holocaust should be remembered and by whom. As the Holocaust becomes more and more a part of Western culture, there are worries that it is becoming trivialized and commercialized, that it might replace the Torah as the central fact of Jewish identity, that Jewish identity will be based on victimhood, especially among a growing number of fourth and fifth generation Jews for whom religiosity is declining as a basis for identity and for whom intermarriage has risen, it's certainly in the United States, to almost 1 in 2 marriages. This is the evil podium. I would like now to share with you some of the post-Holocaust identity narratives I have collected from young Jewish American adults, not necessarily children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, in the hopes of providing some insight into the ways fourth and fifth generation Jews talk about the Holocaust. This is part of a much larger project. I do have Israeli data, but I'm not sharing that with you today, so I'm staying strictly with the Americans today. Do their narratives reflect a traumatic discourse similar to that which Alexander and others have described? How, if at all, is the Holocaust important to the formation and maintenance of their Jewish identities? And what is the meaning of this for contemporary Holocaust discourse? The contemporary post-Holocaust narratives I share with you today should be treated in part as indicators of the ways in which Holocaust post-memories are positioned in the cultural memory and individual consciousness. So I'm doing two levels of analysis, the collective and the personal. So let me just kind of repeat that. So that these post-memories are positioned in the cultural memory and individual consciousness we sometimes refer to as American Jewish identity. I'm extending what Marianne Hirsch calls the post-memory of the Holocaust among the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to a generation of young adults who, like Englander's protagonists in What Do We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank, are neither Holocaust survivor children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren. These identity narratives offer what I call a prism from which to study what Marianne Hirsch calls the postmodern space of cultural memory. Many contemporary scholars suggest that the Holocaust comprises one of the most important bases of American and Israeli Jewish identity, a Jewish, quote, civil religion, again, harking back to yesterday's discussion among the MPs. According to Myers, for most Jews, prior to the Holocaust, American Jewish identity either was a religiously based morality or a loose bond of ethnic solidarity. A rise in awareness of the Holocaust, claims Myers, has produced in many individuals a much more, quote, determined Jewishness, and has become a major factor in sustaining Jewish identity after World War II. Moreover, despite the lack of empirical data for young adults, Chaim Seidler-Feller argues that in the absence of a positive motivation, the Holocaust becomes critical in sustaining Jewish identity. He reasons that the steady diet of Holocaust films, novels, memorials, and museums are the institutional ways in which this generation of young adults creates their identities from the cultural post-memory discourse of the Holocaust. The focus, then, for most young people, he claims, is on victimology, a political identity based both on perceived and real anti-Semitism and the historical reconstructions of being the victim. However, such speculations about the bases and maintenance of Jewish identity, apart from being rather monolithic, are just that, speculations. We have little empirical data to support any of the above assertions one way or another. In the snippet of the narrative I'm about to show you, the young man I interviewed had just told me that for him, the Holocaust is a continual reminder of how we must be ever vigilant about racism, sexism, and hatred of, quote, the other. He connects this vigilance to the ways in which he understands his religious identity. For instance, in the following narrative, he describes the ways in which he and his friends celebrate the Jewish Sabbath. We get together almost every Friday night, although we don't always go to shul, synagogue, and sometimes we don't even have Friday night dinner together, or even light the candles, or make the Kiddush, prayer over wine, or motzi, prayer over bread. But we always sing folk songs together. We bring our guitars and we sing. We sing Hebrew, Yiddish songs from the 60s, but we always end our evening by singing Amazing Grace. For this young adult, a Protestant hymn, originally written in remorse by a white man for his involvement in slave trading, has become part of this young man's Jewish identity repertoire. When I hear Amazing Grace, says this young man, I think Shabbos, Sabbath. For him, the Holocaust is a universal catch-all for all racism. Slavery for him represents a black Holocaust. For some of the young people in my study, the Holocaust represents one expression of their identity, albeit not necessarily the most important or only one. One 30-year-old male explains his position this way. Yeah? Oh, this is cool. I think there are a lot of people whose Jewish identities are very structured by memories of the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel, and they are things I feel strongly about. Neither one is the primary event, however, that structures my Jewish life. I really think an emphasis on either of these two things usually de-emphasizes the way in which one can or sort of understand a Jewish experience that's in the present. Moreover, contrary to Seidler-Fedler's and Meyer's expectations, while the Holocaust subtly infuses their identity narratives, and there is no doubt about that, and I will return to that again, historical reconstructions of being the victim do not. One 28-year-old female claims, Judaism is not just about the past. The Holocaust is a big problem, emphasis hers. I mean, it's crucial, emphasis hers, that we remember it. I've been to Poland, and I studied it and read books, and it's awful. It's the worst thing to happen to the Jewish people or any people, and we have to remember it and read books and tape testimonies from people and make movies and have it immortalized. But what we can't, emphasis hers, do is become a cult of the Holocaust, where our sole identity is based upon guilt that we survived, or determination that it will never happen again, or just rooted in the tragedy. Judaism is much more than that. It has an affirmative message which predated the Holocaust and which will go forward from that. And that has to do with the land and Jerusalem and the food and the music and the culture and the way you live your life. A little bit of a remembrance back to Mark Adler's What's Religion, right? A 20-year-old male put it this way. I don't like to think of it as I don't like to think of it as something where the Jews have suffered through history and we have to protect it. I don't deny it happened that Jews have suffered a lot throughout the ages, but I don't think that's the reason that I choose to go on being Jewish. I don't want to think of myself as a victim of history. Others were very specific about their belief that we actually went to war to liberate or save the Jews, reflecting perhaps what James Young would call the USA's memory of itself, reflecting back on itself about why we entered World War II. One 20-year-old says quite firmly, slide 5, I never quite understood until I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington how important it was for us, the U.S., to save the Jews. I mean, I'm not sure you know just what we knew during the war, but once we knew, there is no doubt that we want it made known to the world that this will never happen again. Little revised history, yeah? Liberation themes are clearly situated within the identity narratives of the young adults under study. We liberated them, one 25-year-old tells me. I lost no family in the Holocaust, and I know very few people who did, he continues. But I know that one of the reasons we went to war was to free those victimized by the Germans. The distancing between himself and them, and the insistence that we went to war because of those who were victimized by the Germans, reveals an interesting take on the entrance of the U.S. into World War II and on being victimized. For this population, the Holocaust is the historical marker against which all other atrocities are compared. When the Holocaust is used as an historical marker, it brings into focus not only events after World War II, but also those which preceded it. Perhaps unwittingly, this results in a kind of revitalization and reshaping of earlier moments of Jewish history and or personal biography. One 27-year-old female suggested that after visiting the Beit HaShoah Museum in Los Angeles, she decided to do a genealogical search. She says, "I don't know. It just hit me. There but for what go I? I mean, here I am. I haven't been touched by the Holocaust directly, not my parents or my grandparents. But then I began to wonder about my mother's family in Poland. Why didn't the whole family leave at the same time? You know, the distant cousins, what happened to them? What was life like for them? I mean, what did they do prior to the war that maybe kept them in Poland longer? And what kind of lives did they lead? I think some of my family were musicians. You know, klezmer stuff. At least I think it was klezmer. We are a part of a family tree, and I wanted to know what the early branches looked like." Others found that Holocaust-related themes led them to an interest in Israel and the belief that Israel is most important in preventing any such cataclysmic event from happening again to the Jewish people. As one 20-year-old male puts it, "You know, I have read some of Elie Wiesel's work. It is awesome. It makes me think, how do people go on after such stuff? I get so angry. I am sure that if Israel had existed during the time of Hitler, so many Jews might not have died. I have some reservations about the current political role of Israel, but I am never willing to have her jeopardize her safety or our claims to that land ever." And while it is clear that the Holocaust is not the only or even necessarily the most salient component of these young people's identity narratives, links to the Holocaust are almost always evident. This is made most explicit in the ways in which these young adults link their identity politics to the Holocaust. For those, for instance, who claim social action as key to their identities, most did so not because of religious mandates, or believing that that's part of a Jewish mandate, but rather as a sensibility and sensitivity as Jews to others' suffering, so much more an historical understanding. For both men and women, active social engagement is clearly linked to their concern for others, and for many as a testament to the larger cultural narrative of never again. For those expressing their politics specifically as a connection to the Holocaust, not, for instance, as part of their religious duty, as some Orthodox Jews do, never again specifically meant never again to any people. This was seen most clearly for those involved in what was formerly Yugoslavia. Others felt their work with Oxfam was another expression of their obligation never to see a population die out. For still others, it was human rights activities directed at South America, Africa, or Asia. So it would be nice for your speakers of yesterday who asked for social action to maybe hear a little of this. Many then were embracing the Holocaust as both Jews and as part of a universal trope, a post-traumatic universal Western trope about the Holocaust as a moral touchstone for the West. My data suggests something both similar to and different from the ways in which earlier writers I have cited conjecture about the Holocaust. For the young adults I studied, their identity narratives go beyond particular victimhood to a post-traumatic worry about a potential Holocaust against all who can easily be othered. The young adults envision their identities in ways that move them beyond their immediate communities, beyond victim to victor or liberator, in their historical recounting, to a more universal reckoning in their identities as Jews. These young people inherit a set of memories and memorials that feed into their identity narratives in ways that allow them, in Alexander's terms, to identify, understand, and judge the kinds of national, ethnic, and ideological forms of racism, sexism that feed genocidal mass killings. James Young reflects on the ways in which cultural and personal memory intersect. He writes, as the period of the Holocaust is shaped in the survivors' diaries and memoirs, in their children's films and novels, public memory of this time is being molded in a proliferating number of memorial images and spaces. Depending on where and by whom these memorials are constructed, these sites remember the past according to a variety of national myths, ideals, and political needs. All reflect both the past experiences and current lives of their communities, as well as the state's memory of itself. While there is no one-to-one effect between institutional and cultural constructions about the Holocaust and individual identity narratives, the worry about the oppressed other, which appears in many of the identity narratives I sampled, suggests that rather than a narrow identity politics, the young people in my study seem to have moved beyond a particularistic victimology to a more general and more universal concern for others. For most in my study, the Holocaust is both the Jewish Shoah and a foundational wound, the Holocaust in Western discourse. So what do we talk about when we talk about the Holocaust? My respondents' narratives are never fully theirs, nor are such identity stories ever unmediated representations of the past or its relationship to the present. Although these young adults' post-Holocaust identity narratives may be fragmentary, mediated, and subject to historical inaccuracies, they do represent a way of bearing witness to the Holocaust. Or as Hirsch and Spitzer put it, witnessing about the event without witness. I am suggesting that this generation of young adults has appropriated a connection to the Holocaust that is akin to Hirsch's concept of post-memory. That is, like children of survivors and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of survivors, they are a generation and historical distance from the Holocaust. And like children of survivors, not only do they have an investment in remembering the Holocaust, but their experience is dominated by narratives that preceded their birth and shaped by a Holocaust discourse, which has emerged by the end of the 20th century and now well into the 21st century as a trauma which can be neither fully understood nor ever recreated. As sites of remembrance, these identity narratives represent indirect, fragmentary stories that reflect and contribute to cultural narratives of Holocaust post-memory, as well as to Jewish identity and Jewish identity politics. The cultural discourse of the Holocaust, with its mandate to witness and to not forget, becomes then the subtle marker for both past and current events. Dominic Lecopra contends that things changed because of the Shoah, and even the events that occurred before it cannot now be understood or read in the same way. This is apparent to me in the ways in which the young adults in my study reinforce their commitment to all that preceded the Holocaust and to their references to a past and a communal present. Many place a great premium on survival over time. They speak of what Judaism has given to the larger culture of any culture of which they are a part. For many, their revisioning of a mythic past comes from what they envision as having been destroyed by the Holocaust. With the Holocaust as a key historical marker, historical precedents are then reimagined and reflected in their contemporary identity narratives and constructions of their Jewish identities. Their narratives reflect the current cultural presentations of the past that emphasize a liberator and or a survival rather than a victim mentality. This victor ideology extends to active participation in political and social activism. And finally, you can hear in their identity narratives a collective consciousness created by Holocaust re-representations in memorials, films, literature, courses, and testimonies. The Holocaust in this discourse belongs to and is the responsibility not just of Jews, but of the West. These post-Holocaust narratives, I believe, represent a narrative form of post-memory. As such narratives will find their revised way back into the cultural collective consciousness, a consciousness that may very well become embedded in tomorrow's Holocaust post-memories. Thank you. I had to cut things down, and so I've left a lot out, and particularly I want to apologize to Deirdre because I did take out all the gender stuff. So if you have questions or you'd like me to expand on something, I'd be delighted to do so in the amount of time we have left. Yes, hi. Wendy. Yeah. This is a fellow sociologist, so. Did you all hear the question? It's about how the use of the Holocaust may be misused, abused by those who turn it against Israel and against Jews. I assume you're talking about, for instance, the Palestinian. Pardon? And even by Jews as well. I think that in part what's very important about your question is that collective cultural discourse never goes unmediated, right? So it's going to come through. It's going to be filtered through political and social and institutional layers, and I think that what we have going, and I do agree with Jeffrey Alexander. I do agree that we have now a post-traumatic discourse, but it can and will be used by others as well. But it never takes away from the fact that the Holocaust will not be forgotten. So that it will always take, of course, rebuttal and contention. Same thing with Holocaust denial. So I don't know that that answers your question, but because it's a process, right, we can assume that we are all still part of that process. What I think is amazing is that it has become a universal trope, even in countries which had nothing to do with World War II. And now we begin to hear, the stories. And it's not just for their own use, because in appropriating it, apart from, of course, in extremist fashion, so I won't even talk about Iran for the moment, but in appropriating it, it also opens up history, for instance, in Shanghai, and the Jews who were hidden, as it were, or who escaped to Shanghai. So I think that unlike other historical events, the Holocaust has moved beyond an event. It has moved, in a sense, beyond history in that sense, because it has become a universal trope. And, of course, it can be misused. Okay, I'll do this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. Nope, then the way back. I'm sorry, I missed the second part. Do I think the... the mention of Jews in the Bible. I'm not sure I know how to answer that. Can you give me an example of what you mean? What is the link? I mean, are you saying the Old Testament as a... Mel Gibson, yeah, Passion, something, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh. I believe in no monocausals. That's number one. I believe that I think that the issue of Christ, Jews as responsible for the death of Christ is a highly constructed argument. So it depends on what it is you choose, right? Because technically speaking, they were not, right? So we could make that kind of argument. But of course, it all has to do with the reading, right, of the Bible. It has to do with the reading of both the Old and the New Testament. And of course, the Catholic Church itself has had some difficulty with this. But it seems to me that I don't know that that's the cause, but it certainly can be pulled up and used as it has.
That's why I prefaced my question by saying if we understood the Old Testament.
I see. I'm sorry,
then,
I missed that.
Yeah, we would not come to that conclusion. But it's because we have, in Christianity, we have separated the Old Testament from the New Testament. Most Christians are New Testament Christians. Mm-hmm. So if we read the entire Bible and understood it, we would understand as Christians. And I think of myself as a believer, not a Christian, because I believe in the whole thing. And we would understand that that is not correct, that the Jews were not responsible. Yeah. Well, the house of Israel, let's put it this way, was not responsible.
I think it depends on who you mean by we when you say reading. And that's always because there is never, of course, one reading, even among Christians. And so it's always contingent. I think it's always contingent on the community, on the context, on the historical moment, on the political moment, and finally on the religious moment.
And on our political leaders.
Pardon?
On our political leaders, because if they don't have the will, then there will always be this belief,
yes,
whatever belief we choose to have.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the question. Yes.
Thank you.
Some of you I recognize from yesterday.
In your contemporary research on these identity narratives,
yes,
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the difference between the male and female identity narratives. Are there hallmarks of the narratives that you see?
Yes, I have a couple of articles published on this, so I can refer you to those at some point. There are very distinct gender differences, and I would both in style and in content. Women are more likely, at least in my sample, to offer a more detailed and more grounded explanation for their values and beliefs about Judaism. Males are more likely to give you a very general picture, right? Racism, sexism, etc. Women will say, if you want to know about racism, you got to get yourself dirty. I worked, for a summer in a ghetto, in a playground, and then they go through all the details, right? Men will say, you got to be ever vigilant about racism. So it's the way in which they ground their experiences. Women will call upon those experiences. Women will mediate those experiences much more than men. Men will give you a much more idealized, as it were, picture. Now, if you're familiar with the literature of some of the literature in psychology of sex differences, which is the old term for psychology of gender differences, as formulated early on by Carol Gilligan, it's the same kind of argument, that men move to this fifth and more universal stage of moral development. Women get stuck at the third level, but I think it's a misinterpretation of what getting stuck means. And so I'm sort of using that particular model or theory as a way of explaining the way in which these young people narrate their differences. So women, unlike men, women will be very concerned about, for instance, being a light unto other nations. That's, what does that say about us? What does chosen mean? Chosen, isn't that a way of making us, sort of a bit superior? Is that the way we're supposed to interpret that? And what does that mean about our relationships with others? I had a woman tell me that, a young woman tell me that she was very concerned about not having enough non-Jews in her life, because all of her connections were with other Jews, and she felt that she wasn't able to be sympathetic and understand other people's values. Nothing even close to that from male. So from my male respondents, talking about their Jewish identities, of course, and giving me the pieces of information that they're offering as what they see as their values and why they are Jewish. So those are just some of the differences in the way in which they're narrated. One last thing, men will be very sure. They will give you definitive statements. Women do a lot of I think, I know, maybe, perhaps, a lot more contingent in their responses.
Did your sample include Jews who might be self-identified as, say, modern Orthodox?
I had very few, but I had, yes, and they were quite different. In fact, you can't really generalize. I had only about 5, so I can't generalize. This is out of 90. So I can't really generalize about that. But I have done a lot of research on the Orthodox communities. My first book was Rachel's Daughters, and I've remained very active in research on Orthodox communities. And of course, there the gender differences are quite evident. But that has a lot to do, much more, I believe, with what is permitted as opposed to what they actually may believe about male and female differences. So. I'm sorry, I did say, here, right? Oh, yes.
I feel that being second generation, I feel that somewhere you skip the fact that my observation is that there is Holocaust fatigue. And I find that in the remarks that you have used, that there is not really much of an understanding of a Holocaust, and that the word Holocaust is being used in a certain way to kind of refer to something that has happened, but not actual knowledge. And my experiences with kids, especially high school kids, was that there was fatigue. They did not know much about it. Now if they spend an hour on the Holocaust in high schools, we're lucky. So there is almost kind of an erasure of it, and there is fatigue. And I use the word fatigue again and again because I find that people are tired of it, and especially young ones.
This may be cultural differences. It may be Canadian versus U.S. I'm not sure about that. I just see very few signs of fatigue among the young adults I interviewed, which are not, by the way, a random sample. My point of doing narrative was to get the voices of these young people, who, by the way, that is the ages between 20 and 30. There is very little data about them. Look at all the Jewish population studies, look at all the Jewish research. They're not interested in that group because they're only interested in the young ones who are either in family and or when they're already forming their own families, because there's I don't want to get into that particular bias that I believe is in Jewish research, but the fact that young people now are marrying later and beginning families later, so that generation is seen as not really very important yet in terms of identity issues. I think it's a huge mistake, and that's why I targeted that population. And the questions that I asked no questions. I had conversations with these young people. And remember, my point was not so much what did they know. What place did the Holocaust, if at all, play in their identity, constructions of Jewish identity? So I don't know that I can answer your question directly. I certainly saw no signs of fatigue, but I saw ways in which the Holocaust was being reworked. There is no doubt in my mind that it is there. What you mean by their knowledge of it, I would say probably it's not just that generation. And also even generation, in other words, the facts of the Holocaust, that's history. That will become history, and we can learn history. But what I think I'm trying to imply is the Holocaust has transcended history in that sense, and that it is a trope. It is there. It is in the culture. It is in the culture of the West. And that way, it will not be forgotten. And you have to work, as we know, at contesting what we would call misuses of the Holocaust. But that it's there is very important.
I see the distinction.
Yeah. Somebody yesterday, and I don't remember, perhaps it was in the Israel, I don't know her name, Naomi, when she said, a story is very powerful. And I think in part what you see among the fourth, fifth, remember these are not youngsters, 20 to 30-year-olds are youngsters to me, are not necessarily children, survivor grandchildren or great-grandchildren. So in fact you have them at a great distance from the Holocaust, and yet it plays an important part. So I think that you're asking an important question, but I think there are different ways of looking at that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is fascinating, Deborah. I want to ask you something that's really not in your field of study, and I really know that it's not in your field of study, but I'm sure you've come across it in doing your field of study. You've pointed to the fact that it's that the Holocaust is a trope in Western thought, etc. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in knowing whether there is any research ongoing into how it functions in very different communities, not Jewish communities, but either non-Jewish communities in places like the United States and Canada, or more specifically in places like Germany specifically, and perhaps Poland. Is there research being done there?
Oh, yes. In fact, I would say, now you had Christian Wilke yesterday talking about memorials in Germany. It is very clear today that when I say the West, by the way, I'm talking about when I say universal, I'm moving beyond Jewish communities.
And that's why I'm asking you.
Yeah. So, and I think it's a really important question. There is enormous amount of work going on in Europe today with countries owning their responsibility in their responsibility. As in Germany today, I think it is very clear that the new trope, if you will, is bystanders are guilty. We were guilty not just of being perpetrators in terms of the Nazis, but as Germans, because we stood by. And that in their museums, in their memorials, this particular trope has been acknowledged. And Poland too. Now there has become much research. I will be going to Poland in June as part of some new research that I am starting. And I think that part of this is that every I'm going to refer back to James Young. Every nation state and this is why it's so important to have it move beyond an historical event with facts and figures that are mind-numbing, right? It's important because there has to be a story that's told that transcends the particulars and moves to some universal and forces us to ask those questions. Every country now we see has taken on some responsibility, some memorials. Now, how they do that can be highly contested. And that was true in Germany with the memorial, because they did not invite many of the Jewish groups they did not invite them to speak at the opening reception of that, because Germany said, this is we're taking this on as ours now, and we're taking that responsibility. So there is this argument about, whose memories are going to be immortalized, right? And how are those memories going to be immortalized? And that's a very important question. And again, it's contested. It's political. And we do have to be aware of how these things are. I spoke before I had all the facts together. I am not remembering correctly. I know that there was a huge argument. Perhaps there's someone in the audience who knows better than I. When that memorial opened, the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, the one in Berlin, there was some argument. I think in the last analysis they ended up actually having, it was not so much they didn't invite them, they did not want them they wanted to say that this is our form of mourning, this is our form of mourning, and we're going to present it this way. It leads to complications, serious complications. Okay, I want to retract that. I spoke without. I don't have all the facts in hand, so I'm going to retract that for the moment. I just know that it was contested. I'm going to go here and then here and here. Yes.
I just want to go back to something you started with, which is the long period of time before this became so entrenched in people's thinking. I believe it was the first big major biography of Hitler was done by Alan Bullock of Oxford University. And I read that, I was over there, it was in his college, and I read it in 1963, and even I, who had aunts and uncles who died, didn't note at the time that he only had 14
Jews, right?
In about 1,000
Right,
brilliant book.
right.
When he died a couple of years ago, in things I read that people had said about him, there's one regret about that book is he had minimized or overlooked, basically, the role of the Jews in the Second World War. Right. That wasn't unique to him. The history took a very, very long time to really begin to deal with the essential Jewish role in the Second World War by the Nazis and how it played this role. And that's quite fascinating looking back at it as to why it took that long to really, on the part of historians, to really try to address the question.
Yes. I think there are many reasons, the same reasons why the Salzburgers, for instance, did not wish to put Judaicide on the front page, because they would be accused of not giving the real truth because they were Jews. And so, that's at least their response to why they identified Jews, really the inescapable fact that this was a Judaicide, that they kept that in the back pages because they were afraid that if they put it on the front pages, the response would be, oh yeah, you're just exaggerating this issue because you're Jewish and you're focusing on it. Raoul Hilberg does not mention the Holocaust. The word Holocaust is not in his book, the destruction of the Jews. It's interesting how, and that was in 1963. Even then, the term had yet to be narrated. The term was coming into being. It isn't just that it took a long time to recognize. I think what I'm trying to say is that the emotional impact of going from discrete events, historical events, the facts, going from those events and a progressive discourse of victory over evil kind of thing, moved as testimony, as stories, as we came to, as Dominic Copper would argue, is a psychoanalytic intellectual historian who argues that you need that distance to mourn, not because we directly experience this, but because we are all traumatized by this, and that it takes that distance. So he would argue, for instance, that the social action that these young people claim as part of their identities as Jews is a form of mourning, of contemporary mourning, by those who are so distanced. And some now argue that the whole focus on the Holocaust, particularly in memorials in Europe, is also another form of contemporary mourning for what has happened. So it's the cultural narrative takes on. Not only does the silence break, but what we mean by Holocaust changes in that sense. That it becomes a part for all of us, not just for those who suffered. It was always a trauma for those who suffered. Yes, there were some more questions. Yes.
This may not be not in the area you covered today, but I thought, given this is your area of study, you might have an answer for me. I was told that there was a Jewish professor a Jewish teacher applied to work at my old high school, which used to be quite Jewish, and was taken aside and told, "We'll give you the job if you want, but you really don't want to work here." This is a very anti-Semitic school. Mm-hmm. Is that a bizarre exception, or do you find that it was explained to me that this was because it was a heavily, the new population there was heavily immigrant, mm-hmm. and that was the explanation for the rise in anti-Semitism, and that the immigrants were, passing on what they'd been raised with to the other students who were native Canadians. And
I'm not suggesting that if the Holocaust is a universal trope, that anti-Semitism has gone away. So, I mean, it could be it could be what it is. Even Freud said sometimes a cigar is really just a cigar. It could be that, in fact, they really felt that this might prove to be very complicated for this teacher. It doesn't sound like that's actually what the real reason is, and it might be a form of anti-Semitism. There would be you would have to have a fuller context to know the meaning of that.
No, I wasn't asking about meaning. I meant, did you come across that kind of...
Oh, did I come across
have you ever heard of that? Was this a really isolated incident, or do you... what they were telling me was that that entire classes had gotten up and left in protest if the Holocaust had ever been brought up as an issue in the classroom.
Yeah. Did I personally come across that in my research? No. But what I do know is that despite one of my colleagues at Northeastern is a man named Jack Levin, who is probably one of the foremost criminologists in the world, and he studies anti-Semitism, he studies all kinds of things. And Jack claims that if you look at the data, even in Europe, and even with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, that actually anti-Semitism has decreased. Yeah. And I think somebody yesterday said that, pardon? Well, you see, because we can only, when you put the data into a larger spectrum and you look at the trends and you look at the number of incidences, when we experience it, that's total. That's anti-Semitism. But the facts are that it actually has decreased. These extremist groups, and by the way, in the United States particularly, they are isolated. And the ADL says the same thing. So It depends. Pardon? Well, it's controversial, but the actually the suggestion is that it actually has decreased. There are pockets, but it depends both on the communities that you're talking about. But when you look at it overall, we certainly do not see an increase. We do not see an increase, but we do see a decrease. I'm sorry. I think time is. I'll be happy to talk. To you.
Invite everybody to informal conversations that be in the foyer where they're drinking coffee and snacks.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're a great audience. That's a good question.